Well, I think it's pretty courageous that you two started a company that focuses on mental health. But I imagine that between being female founders, women of color, and building a company around a topic that's been hush hush forever meant really starting a business that was met with probably a lot of challenges. So, what are some of the highs and lows that you guys have experienced while running and building Shine?
Yeah, it's such a good question, and I love that you asked that as someone that is a fellow founder. Obviously, what so many people see is all the cool, exciting stuff, and often what people don't see is the behind the scenes of everything that goes into starting your own company, which is such a privilege, and also one of the hardest, most challenging, and exciting things we've ever done. So, in terms of the process, so there's a couple things, obviously, like personally, navigating highs and lows, as well as just the fundraising process. So for context, we're VC backed, which is an incredible opportunity for Shine. And from a numbers perspective, it's just not in your favor as a woman
Yeah.
or a woman of color. Particularly, we are so underrepresented in the VC space, and that's something that we're really passionate about changing. And hopefully, young women out there can see themselves more and more as we get more female founders that are actually getting backed by venture capital companies. What was hard from a professional standpoint in the beginning is it's interesting to your question earlier around, like, it's self-care now is so big, but self-help, the terminology, kind of reigned for years and years and years, and we have noticed just in the last 3 years a huge change in how people are responding to this industry from an investment standpoint, and I think it's very, very equal to what people are kind of experiencing in their day-to-day life. So obviously, taking care of ourselves and fulfillment, this has been around since Aristotle. Like, we as humans
Right.
are always trying to figure out how do we take better care of ourselves. But when we first started out 3 years ago, the industry was early. And we were two women, and we were talking about a company that was rooted in emotion and feelings, and how can you take care of yourself. And unfortunately, the response and some of the bias to that is that this was soft.
Right.
We got a lot of questions like, "Oh, or is it a not for profit?" We were like, "Oh, it's a business. It's a for profit, which is why we're here."
Yeah.
And I think that was just so loaded. I think the idea of having a mission driven company that can have an impact on millions and millions of people all across the world, most people saw that as charity versus understanding the big business opportunity. And we're so proud of the fact that fast forward 3 years later, as a society, there's still a lot of work to be done, but we're waking up to the fact that as much as we talk about taking care of ourselves physically, we have to talk about taking care of ourselves emotionally and mentally.
Yeah.
And the industry itself is a huge industry, um, and also it can make a change. It can impact people's life, and we can build a big business that's rooted in values that we really are proud of, as well as create a massive business. And so that's been probably the biggest change that we've felt over the course of the last 3 years. And it's really been interesting to see the change in people's excitement around the industry that wasn't entirely there for a lot of investors early on.
Right.
Um, from a personal or professional standpoint, how do we navigate the highs and lows? I mean, there's so many things, and it's a constant journey. I think a couple themes that have really helped us along the way is pressure as a privilege. The reminder that the opportunity to really represent our community of 4 million people in 189 countries is something that I know for Mara and myself, we wake up to every single morning and think, like, how can we make a difference for them? How can we continue to see them? How can we continually support them in their journey? And so recommending that, or realizing and remembering that pressure is part of this opportunity that we've wanted for a long time. And I think the other thing is compassion, and self-compassion is such a huge part of Shine, and it's one of the biggest themes that resonates with our community. We're helping people take the same compassion that they extend outwards and bring it back to themselves. And I think we have to do that as founders as well. Obviously, your job and part of why you're in a position to really be ambitious and work really hard is because you're critical of yourself, and you're always looking for ways to improve, and that's such a beautiful side of growth. And at the same time, I think Mara and I try to check ourselves in a really positive way and check each other and say, hey, that was really good, or this is a really big win, because if you don't do that, I think particularly as founders, you won't practice what you preach and take the moment to reflect on all of the hard work and what it's amounted to.
Right, right. Well, and speaking of your hard work, I'm curious how you guys manage the overwhelming trend in self care now. I mean, as you said, when you started, I mean, certainly people, it was still called self help. It was definitely thought of as soft. And now there's way more popularity around self care, and almost to the point where I would argue like some of it doesn't always feel genuine. It feels very much like they're trying to make the buck off of you and kind of like use the emotional, mental piece. I know I'm making this sound really negative, but you guys know what I'm talking about. So there's overwhelming trend of self care. And how do you manage that knowing that like you are putting out amazing tools that really work, and kind of just the trendiness of this happening right now?
Yeah, it's a good point that it's definitely having a moment. And to Naomi's point, when we first started even Shine just a few years ago, people would ask us like, is this self-help? Is this, intentionality? What industry is this? And we were like, we don't know. And so we spent a lot of time knowing that we felt the shift happening. We very much felt it in our own relationship, but in just in our own community, and seeing people search for more preventative habitual tools around taking care of themselves. But we took a full step back when we first started the company and really looked at the trend over the past 20, 30 years, from self help, as you mentioned, to self care. And so when we think about self help, we often, it kind of by nature feels kind of stigmatized. Like it's not like a cool thing, and that, we think self help of 80s and 70s and 80s. You had your gurus, whether that was Oprah to Tony Robbins. You had a bit of a focus on mental health, but it typically was media, right? You had
Right.
books, but you didn't really want to be caught dead reading the books.
Yeah.
And then you had more of a focus on physical health. So, whether that was Atkins or Jenny Craig.
Yeah.
And, of course, this is all pre anti Photoshop movements, or really even much of the internet. And so you were still comparing yourself to the glossy magazines and the A-list celebrities in those magazines. And self-help was about, how can I be better as soon as possible? How can I look like that so I can feel like that,
Yeah.
right? And then when we think about what happened over the next 20 or 30 years, you have obviously technology, social media, globalization. All of a sudden, we had more access to more data points on how everyone else was doing and feeling and, thriving than we ever had before. So we weren't just hearing about our neighbors and our classmates and our coworkers. We were hearing about hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people, and kind of how they were doing.